The American West was never the golden land of opportunity promised by the brochures in the East. For most, it was a vast, unforgiving cathedral of dust and silence. By the 1870s, the frontier was a jagged edge where civilization crumbled into the sagebrush. Here, the horizon didn't represent freedom. It represented an empty stomach. The land was beautiful, certainly, but it was a cruel beauty that could kill a man with a week of drought or a single night of blue north wind. In this vacuum of authority, poverty wasn't just a hardship. It was a catalyst. Imagine a young man, perhaps a veteran of a war that left him with nothing but a limp and a hollow stare, standing on a patch of dirt in the Kansas territory. He has spent 3 years trying to coax life out of soil that seems to hate him. His cattle are ribs and hide. His well has turned to alkaline sludge, and the banks in the East are sending letters written in cold, ink-black demands. To stay honest was to watch his family wither into the very dust they plowed. This was the breeding ground for the outlaw. The transition from farmer to fugitive rarely happened overnight. It was a slow erosion of the soul. It began when a man realized that the law was a luxury he could no longer afford. In the saloons of towns like Dodge City or Deadwood, the air was thick with the smell of cheap rye and the desperation of men who had run out of options. They looked at the passing stagecoaches, armored boxes of gold and silk, and saw not just a target but a way out. The geography itself dictated the crime. The West was too big to be policed. A man could commit a robbery in the morning and be swallowed by the jagged canyons of the Badlands by sunset, hidden by a labyrinth of red rock where no sheriff dared to ride alone. This isolation created a lawless land, but it wasn't just the absence of sheriffs. It was the presence of a different kind of survival. In the silence of the Great Plains, the only thing louder than the wind was the clicking of a Colt peacemaker's hammer. The Wild West was born not from a desire for chaos, but from the crushing weight of the horizon. When the land gives you nothing and the law offers no protection, the gun becomes the only tool left to level the playing field. These men didn't choose the life of an outlaw because they loved the thrill of the chase. They chose it because, in a world of dust and desperation, a fast horse and a loaded cylinder were the only things that felt like hope. The American Civil War did not truly end at Appomattox. For many, the violence simply migrated west, bleeding into the soil of the frontier. The men who would become the West's most feared outlaws, names like Jesse James, Cole Younger, and their ilk, did not emerge from a vacuum. They were the jagged remnants of a conflict that had stripped away their humanity and replaced it with the cold, calculated efficiency of the guerrilla fighter. When the formal armies marched home, a generation of young men remained, haunted by trauma and possessing a lethal set of skills that had no place in a peaceful society. The war in the border states, particularly Missouri and Kansas, had been a different kind of hell. It wasn't characterized by grand charges or honorable surrenders, but by bushwhacking, a brutal form of partisan warfare. Men learned to strike from the shadows, to execute enemies in cold blood, and to vanish into the brush before the smoke cleared. These were not soldiers, they were ghosts. They lived off the land, relied on secret networks of sympathizers, and viewed the law as nothing more than the will of their oppressors. To them, a badge was just a target, and a bank was a resource belonging to the enemy. When the smoke finally cleared in 1865, these men found themselves in a world they no longer recognized. Their homes had been burned, their families scattered, and their names placed on blacklists. The trauma of the war had created a psychological point of no return. Having spent their formative years witnessing and committing atrocities, the concept of returning to a plow or a shop counter felt like a slow death. The adrenaline of the raid was the only thing that made them feel alive. They refused to lay down their guns because the gun was the only thing that had ever kept them safe. Furthermore, the tactics they perfected in the brush became the blueprint for the classic American bank and train robbery. The hit-and-run style, the use of multiple scouts, and the tactical retreat into difficult terrain were all lessons learned under the black flag of the guerrilla. They operated with a military precision that terrified local law enforcement. For these men, the transition from soldier to outlaw was not a moral fall, but a tactical shift. They viewed themselves as displaced warriors continuing a private war against a government they felt had betrayed them. By the time the 1870s rolled around, the outlaw spirit was firmly etched into the American West. It was a spirit born of blood, fire, and the refusal to surrender. The gritty reality was that the frontier offered a perfect canvas for their unresolved rage. The war had broken their moral compasses, leaving them with a hollowed-out sense of right and wrong, where the only thing that mattered was loyalty to the gang and the speed of the draw. They were the walking ghosts of a broken nation, and the West was about to feel the full weight of their shadows. As the steam locomotive, the iron horse, clattered across the vast expanses of the American West, it carried more than just passengers and mail. It carried the lifeblood of a growing nation, gold bullion, payroll cash, and the concentrated wealth of Eastern investors. To the outlaws lurking in the sagebrush, these trains were not symbols of progress. They were moving treasure chests, vulnerable and ripe for the taking. The era of the train robbery had arrived, bringing with it a level of terrifying precision that turned the railway into a high-stakes battleground. A train heist was not a feat of impulsive desperation. It was a masterpiece of tactical engineering. The gangs that ruled the rails, such as the Wild Bunch or the James Younger Gang, approached a robbery with the mindset of a military operation. They studied schedules, mapped out the loneliest stretches of track where help was hours away, and utilized the very technology that defined the era. A common tactic involved the forced stop, piling crossed eyes on the tracks or dangling a red lantern to signal danger. When the engineer pulled the brakes, the silence of the prairie was shattered by the thunder of hooves and the rhythmic barking of Winchesters. Once the train hissed to a halt in the middle of nowhere, the precision was chilling. While some gang members held the passengers at gunpoint, stripping them of watches and wallets in a frantic, terrifying blur, the specialists headed for the express car. This was the fortress of the train, often guarded by a lone messenger who refused to open the heavy sliding doors. In these moments, the outlaws turned to the giant, dynamite. The roar of an explosion would peel back the iron sides of the car like a tin can, sending shards of wood and metal into the night air. The terror felt by those on board was absolute. The isolated nature of the frontier meant there was no 911 to call, no sirens on the horizon. There was only the smell of coal smoke, the acrid scent of gunpowder, and the sight of masked men silhouetted against the sparks of the locomotive. The outlaws knew that speed was their only protection. They had to blow the safe, bag the loot, and vanish into the darkness before the telegraph lines, which they often cut beforehand, could alert the next town. These heists were high-stakes gambles. A single mistake could lead to a gruesome derailment or a shootout with railway bulls, hired guards who lived in the cars specifically to kill robbers. Yet, for the gangs, the reward justified the risk. A single successful hit could yield tens of thousands of dollars, enough to buy a year of silence and safety in a remote hideout. The tracks became a vein of gold, and the men who bled it dry became the stuff of dark legend, proving that in the Wild West, even the unstoppable march of the machine could be brought to a violent, screeching halt. The dime novels of the 19th century painted the outlaws of the West as social bandits, Robin Hood figures with lightning-fast draws and hearts of gold. But the reality found in the dusty archives and coroner's reports is far more sobering. When you peel back the yellowing paper of the wanted posters, you don't find heroes or even suave villains. You find men who were deeply flawed, frequently violent, and more often than not, living in a state of perpetual, gut-wrenching terror. The legend of the outlaw was a mask. The reality was a man shivering in a rain-soaked canyon, wondering if his partner was about to kill him for his share of the gold. Take, for instance, the myth of the fair fight. In the movies, two men face off in the center of town at high noon. In reality, the household names we know, men like Billy the Kid or Jesse James, rarely engaged in anything resembling a fair contest. They were survivors. Billy the Kid's kills were often the result of ambushes or shots fired from behind cover. These men weren't looking for honor, they were looking to stay alive. The deadly gunslinger was often just a young man with a hair-trigger temper and a heavy dose of lead-poisoned impulsivity. Beyond the violence, there was the crushing weight of paranoia. To be a household name meant that every stranger in every saloon was a potential assassin. The reward money on their heads was often more than a common laborer could earn in a lifetime. This turned the outlaws' world into a hall of mirrors. They couldn't sleep in the same place twice. They couldn't trust the women they loved or the men they rode with. Records suggest that Jesse James, toward the end of his life, was a man consumed by anxiety, living under an alias in a modest home, constantly checking the windows and jumping at the sound of a floorboard creaking. His death, shot in the back while hanging a picture, was the ultimate manifestation of the outlaw reality. There was no dignity in the end, only the sudden coldness of betrayal. Physical health was another forgotten struggle. The glamorous life on the trail meant chronic dysentery, rotting teeth, and untreated gunshot wounds that ached with every change in the weather. These were men living on the ragged edge of exhaustion. The Billy the Kid we see in the only authenticated tintype isn't a dashing rogue. He's a buck-toothed, disheveled teenager who looks more like a victim of his circumstances than a master of his fate. Deconstructing these legends doesn't make their stories less interesting. It makes them more human. By finding the terrified, flawed men underneath the myths, we see the American West for what it truly was. A place of extreme pressure that broke people in unique and violent ways. They weren't larger-than-life figures. They were men who had been swallowed by a dark reputation they could never outrun, trapped in a cycle of violence that offered no exit but the grave. In the geography of the American West, there were places where the law simply did not exist, vast, jagged pockets of stone and shadow that the maps labeled as impassable. To the U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton detectives, these were the dead zones. But to the outlaws who lived by the gun, they were the ultimate sanctuary. Hideouts like Hole in the Wall in Wyoming, Robbers' Roost in Utah, and the Browns Park region became the secret capitals of an invisible empire. Here, a man could commit a daylight robbery in a bustling town, and within 48 hours, vanish so completely it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Hole in the Wall was perhaps the most legendary of these fortresses. It wasn't a cave, but a secluded valley in the Big Horn Mountains, guarded by a sheer red sandstone cliff. The only entrance was a narrow trail so treacherous that a single man with a Winchester could hold off an entire cavalry troop. It was a natural citadel. Inside, the outlaw trail became a tangible reality. There were cabins, corrals, and a rough-hewn social order. It was a place where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid could unsaddle their horses, clean their wounds, and trade stolen cattle without ever looking over their shoulders. In these high mountain hideouts, the air was thin, the water was cold, and the long arm of the law felt like a distant, powerless fairy tale. Further south, Robbers' Roost sat amidst a labyrinth of desert canyons, so confusing that even seasoned scouts feared to enter. The terrain was a nightmare of slick rock, deep sand, and hidden springs known only to the fugitives. To live in the Roost was to live in a world of silence. The outlaws who stayed there developed a sixth sense for the landscape, learning which slot canyons led to water and which led to a dead end. They were the only ones who knew the secret paths through the land of the outlaws, a territory where nature itself acted as a silent accomplice to their crimes. However, life in these secret hideouts was far from a vacation. It was a gritty, survivalist existence. While they were safe from the gallows, they were at the mercy of the elements. Winters in the Hole in the Wall were brutal, with snow piling high against cabin doors and food running dangerously low. In the desert reaches of Robbers' Roost, the heat was a physical weight, and a dried-up spring meant a slow, agonizing death. These men lived like wolves, free, but constantly prowling, always tethered to the harsh realities of the wilderness. These no-man's lands created a unique culture of the frontier, a brotherhood of the displaced. In the hideouts, it didn't matter what your name was or what you had done back east. All that mattered was that you could ride, you could shoot, and you could keep your mouth shut. For a few decades, these geological fortresses allowed the outlaw legend to breathe. They were the last bastions of the lawless West, where the horizon offered a temporary, stone-cold promise of safety for those bold enough to claim it. In the popular imagination, the outlaws of the frontier were bound by a romanticized code of the West, a set of unwritten rules rooted in rugged individualism and a strange, distorted sense of loyalty. It was whispered in saloons that an outlaw would never betray a comrade, never steal from a woman, and always face his enemy head-on. But in the windswept canyons and candlelit cabins of the outlaw trail, the reality was far more predatory. The only true code was survival, and while loyalty existed, it was often a fragile thing, easily shattered by the siren song of a gold-filled satchel or the terrifying shadow of a hangman's noose. The unwritten rules were born of necessity rather than morality. For a gang to function, there had to be a baseline of trust. You didn't talk to the law, you shared the loot equally, and you never left a wounded man behind if he could still ride. This was the honor among thieves that allowed groups like the Wild Bunch to operate for years. In the isolated hideouts of the Badlands, a man's word was his currency. If you were known as a stool pigeon or a quitter, the frontier became a very small, very lethal place. To break the code was to invite a bullet, often delivered by your closest friend before the sun went down. However, the promise of gold acted as a powerful solvent on these bonds of brotherhood. When a stagecoach robbery netted a fortune in double eagles, the math of loyalty began to change. In the gritty reality of the West, men weren't just running from the law. They were running from a life of crushing poverty. When faced with enough money to disappear to South America or buy a ranch under a new name, the temptation to simplify the division of spoils became overwhelming. A midnight ride could end not in a safe house, but with a shallow grave in the desert, as one partner decided that half of the loot was not nearly as good as all of it. Betrayal was not always about greed. Often it was about fear. As the wanted posters began to offer rewards that reached staggering heights, thousands of dollars for a single head, the pressure on the gang became unbearable. The law didn't just chase outlaws, they squeezed them. They arrested their sisters, burned their family farms, and offered full pardons to any man who would deliver his leader's corpse. This was the knife in the back that ended the careers of the most famous desperados. The most iconic example of this broken code was the death of Jesse James. He wasn't taken down by a heroic marshal in a street fight. He was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford, a member of his own inner circle who had been promised a bounty and immunity. It was the ultimate violation of the outlaw code, yet it was the most common ending to the outlaw story. In the end, the Code of the West was a myth that outlaws told themselves to feel like soldiers rather than criminals. The truth was much grittier. In a world where everyone has a price, the only man you can truly trust is the one looking back at you from the surface of a canyon pool. And even then, you'd better keep your hand on your holster. The Hollywood quick-draw duel is perhaps the greatest lie ever told about the American West. In the movies, two men stand in a sun-drenched street, waiting for a clock to strike noon, moving with surgical grace. The reality of a frontier shootout was something far more visceral, terrifying, and profoundly ugly. It wasn't a ballet of steel. It was a chaotic, messy scramble for survival where the air turned thick with the smell of sulfur and the screams of the wounded. A real gunfight rarely lasted more than 30 seconds, and in that half-minute, the world dissolved into a blur of smoke and panic. The primary difference between myth and reality was the equipment. Black powder revolvers of the era, like the Colt single-action army, didn't just produce a bang. They produced a massive, opaque cloud of white smoke. After the first two shots, the participants often couldn't see their targets. They were firing blindly into a fog of their own making. There was no aiming in the modern sense. Men didn't use the sights. They point-fired, jerking the trigger in a desperate attempt to put lead into the silhouette in front of them. It was less a test of marksmanship and more a test of who could keep their nerves from shattering long enough to hit something. Furthermore, the one-shot kill was a rarity. The lead bullets of the 19th century were slow and heavy. They didn't always stop a man instantly unless they hit the brain or the spine. It was common for a man to be shot 3 or 4 times and keep fighting, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror, only to collapse minutes later once the excitement faded. This led to messy endings, men grappling in the dirt, bleeding out while trying to club each other with empty pistols. There was no dignity in the dust of Tombstone or Abilene. There was only the frantic, guttural struggle to draw breath. Distance also played a role that the movies ignore. Most street fights actually happened at a range of less than 10 feet, often inside a cramped, dimly lit saloon. At that distance, the concussive blast of the gunfire was deafening, shattering eardrums and blowing out oil lamps, plunging the scene into darkness. Bystanders were frequently the real victims. In the chaos, stray bullets traveled through thin wooden walls, striking people in the next room. A shootout wasn't a private affair between two rivals. It was a public disaster that left the community scarred and the floorboards soaked in copper-smelling blood. Finally, there was the aftermath. In cinema, the hero blows the smoke from his barrel and walks away. In the real West, the winner of a gunfight was often left shaking, vomiting from the shock, or facing a lifetime of infection from a minor wound. The steel and lead of the frontier didn't create legends. It created orphans, widows, and crippled men who spent the rest of their days haunted by the 30 seconds that ruined their lives. It was a gritty, unvarnished reality where the only thing cheaper than the whiskey was human life. In the male-dominated chronicles of the Old West, history often paints women as either the saintly schoolteacher or the weary pioneer mother. But tucked away in the shadows of the wanted posters is a far more dangerous truth: the bandit queens. These were women who looked at the suffocating constraints of 19th century society and chose the saddle and the six-shooter instead. They weren't just tag-alongs or outlaw girlfriends. They were strategists, horse thieves, and fugitives who were often just as fast as their male counterparts, and out of sheer necessity, twice as dangerous. For a woman to turn outlaw, the stakes were infinitely higher. If a man was caught, he faced the gallows. If a woman was caught, she faced a unique kind of social vitriol and a legal system that didn't know whether to treat her as a delicate flower or a demonic anomaly. This meant that the women of the outlaw trail, figures like Belle Starr, Pearl Hart, and Cattle Annie, had to be smarter and more ruthless to survive. They operated in a world where they were constantly underestimated, a tactical advantage they used to devastating effect. While a posse looked for a gang of bearded men, a lone woman in a split skirt could ride right past them with a colonial's worth of stolen gold hidden in her saddlebags. Belle Starr, the bandit queen of the Cookson Hills, became a master of the legal and illegal landscape. She didn't just rob, she managed. She transformed her home into a sanctuary for fugitives, acting as a broker for stolen livestock, and a legal strategist for men who were better at shooting than thinking. She was famously seen riding side saddle with a pair of .45 revolvers strapped to her waist, a visual defiance of every Victorian standard. Her danger lay not just in her aim, but in her intellect. She knew how to manipulate the law as skillfully as she handled a Winchester. Then there were the likes of Pearl Hart, who committed one of the last recorded stagecoach robberies in Arizona. When she was eventually caught and sent to Yuma Territorial Prison, she became a media sensation, proving that a woman with a gun was a far more potent symbol of frontier chaos than any man. These women often had to be more violent to command respect from the hardened men they led or rode with. In a world of predators, they had to prove they were the apex. They learned to break horses, live off the land, and endure the same grueling trail conditions that broke lesser men. The stories of these female fugitives are often forgotten because they didn't fit the neat narrative of the American West. They were messy, complicated, and fiercely independent. They weren't seeking a Robin Hood reputation. They were seeking agency in a world that offered them none. The gritty reality is that the women of the wild were a testament to the fact that the frontier didn't care about gender. It only cared about who was fast enough to survive the night. They left a trail of spent shells and broken hearts across the territories, proving that the outlaw spirit was never a boys' club. In the romanticized tailies of the Old West, the line between the hero and the villain is as sharp as a razor's edge. However, the gritty truth of the frontier was far more blurred. The men who wore the tin stars, the sheriffs, marshals, and deputies, were often cut from the same rough cloth as the outlaws they hunted. In many territories, the only difference between a cold-blooded killer and a lawman was a 5-pointed piece of metal pinned to a dusty vest. For many, the badge wasn't a symbol of a moral awakening. It was a legal shield that allowed them to continue a life of violence with the full backing of the state. The reformed outlaw was a common fixture of the Western landscape. Frontier towns were desperate for men who were hard enough to face down the psychopathic gunmen drifting in from the prairies. They didn't need a philosopher, they needed a predator. This led to a strange, symbiotic relationship between the law and the underworld. A man like Wild Bill Hickok or Wyatt Earp carried a reputation for lethality that preceded them. They were men who had spent time on both sides of the law, gambling, brawling, and sometimes standing on the wrong side of a wanted poster, before realizing that being the hunter paid better and carried less risk of a hanging. Wearing the badge was often a matter of survival and pragmatism. For a former outlaw, becoming a lawman meant an end to the life on the run. It provided a steady salary, a place in the community, and most importantly, the right to shoot first. Many of these lawmen utilized the same guerrilla tactics they had learned as fugitives. They didn't always read a man his rights. They ambushed him in a dark alley or shot him while he was reaching for a drink. They justified this violence under the guise of maintaining order, but to the victims and their families, it felt like nothing more than state-sanctioned murder. The lawman's burden was the psychological toll of this duality. These men lived in a state of permanent tension, knowing that the very outlaws they chased were often their former friends or mirrors of their younger selves. There was a dark irony in a sheriff walking into a saloon to arrest a man for a crime he himself had committed 5 years prior. This tension often led to a shoot-to-kill mentality. It was easier to bury a man who knew your secrets than to bring him to trial. The peace they kept was a graveyard peace. built on a foundation of intimidation and the heavy weight of a peacemaker. By the time the frontier began to close, the era of the outlaw lawman became a liability for a nation trying to appear civilized. The very traits that made these men effective, their ruthlessness, their intimacy with violence, and their disregard for due process, eventually made them dinosaurs. They were the necessary evils of a lawless age, men who used a badge to justify the darkness in their hearts, proving that in the Wild West, justice wasn't about right or wrong. It was simply about who held the legal authority to pull the trigger. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Wild West faced a new kind of predator, one that didn't wear a local sheriff's badge or hide in a canyon. This was a corporate entity, cold and relentless, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. With their iconic logo of an unblinking eye and the slogan, "We never sleep," the Pinkertons became the world's most feared manhunting machine. They were the private army of the railroads and banks, transforming the hunt for outlaws from a local pursuit into a calculated international business. For the first time, a man couldn't just cross the state line to escape his past. The Pinkertons were already there, waiting in the shadows. What made the Pinkertons so terrifying was their methodology. Unlike the local marshal, who was limited by county borders and a small budget, the Pinkertons operated on a national scale. They pioneered the use of a centralized criminal database, sharing photographs, mugshots, and detailed descriptions of outlaws across the country. They turned the telegraph and the train, the very symbols of the civilization outlaws hated, into weapons of the hunt. If the James Younger gang robbed a bank in Missouri, Pinkerton agents in Chicago, New York, and Denver were instantly alerted. They didn't just chase outlaws. They stalked them, utilizing undercover agents who would infiltrate gangs and live among them for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The agency's persistence was legendary and, at times, brutal. They were the ones who famously chased Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid all the way to the mountains of Bolivia. To a Pinkerton agent, a wanted poster wasn't a suggestion, it was a contract. However, this private justice often bypassed the spirit of the law. Because they were private employees and not government officials, they frequently operated in a moral gray area. They were known for using degree interrogation tactics, kidnapping suspects across state lines, and most infamously, using explosives. In their obsession with catching Jesse James, Pinkerton agents threw an incendiary device into his family home, killing his young half-brother and blowing off his mother's arm, an act of violence that actually turned public sympathy toward the outlaw. For the outlaws, the Pinkertons represented the shadow that never left. It was a psychological war. Knowing that a multi-million-dollar corporation was dedicated to your capture meant that no hideout was truly safe. The agency hired specialized manhunters like Charlie Siringo, who spent years in the saddle, tracking his targets with the patience of a wolf. They were the harbingers of the modern age, proving that as the world became more connected, there was nowhere left for the wild to hide. The rise of the Pinkertons signaled the end of the frontier era. They represented the transition from the law of the gun to the law of the file cabinet. By the time the agency reached its peak, the outlaw wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting a system. The iron horse and the unblinking eye worked together to fence in the open range, proving that in the new America, justice was no longer a matter of local grit. It was a high-stakes corporate operation where the house always won. In the movies, the outlaw's life is one of grand adventure, campfire songs, and the thrill of the chase. In reality, being a fugitive in the American West was a grueling, slow-motion nightmare. It was a life defined by the sleepless nights and the constant paranoia, a psychological erosion that turned even the toughest men into hollow shells of themselves. Once a man's face appeared on a wanted poster, the world shrank. The vast, open prairie was no longer a place of freedom. It was an exposed plain where every silhouette on the horizon was a potential hangman. The physical toll was the first thing to break a man. Living on the Dodge meant months without a real bed or a hot meal. Outlaws lived in the saddle blanket world, sleeping with one eye open and a hand on a cold revolver. They suffered from chronic exposure. The biting winters of Wyoming and the blistering heat of the Arizona deserts weren't just discomforts. They were slow killers. Without access to doctors, a simple infected tooth or a festering saddle sore could become a death sentence. By the time many of these men reached their 30s, they looked 50, their skin leathery from the sun and their lungs raspy from the dust of 1,000 miles of retreat. But the mental toll was far more devastating. Paranoia became a permanent state of being. Every stranger encountered at a lonely crossroads, every traveler sharing a campfire, and every bartender pouring a drink was a potential threat. Was that rider a genuine drifter, or was he a Pinkerton agent in disguise? Was the gold in the saddlebag worth the fact that he could never again walk into a brightly lit room without sitting with his back to the wall? This fugitive's itch meant they could never truly rest. The sound of a snapping twig in the night or the distant bark of a dog wasn't just a noise. It was an adrenaline spike that sent the heart hammering against the ribs. Socially, the life was one of profound isolation. An outlaw couldn't write letters to his mother without risking her arrest. He couldn't visit his wife without a posse surrounding the house. The brotherhood of the gang often curdled under this pressure. When the walls closed in, the men you rode with became your greatest danger. They knew your habits, your weaknesses, and the price on your head. The air in an outlaw camp was thick with a toxic mix of boredom and hair-trigger tension. The gritty reality of life on the run was that the chase almost always outlasted the runner. Most outlaws eventually grew tired of the cold, tired of the fear, and tired of the silence. Some turned themselves in just for the chance to sleep in a cell with a roof. Others became reckless, seeking out a final, violent confrontation just to make the noise in their heads stop. They were men who had traded their futures for a moment of fast money, only to find that the freedom of the trail was actually a prison without bars, where the only thing waiting at the end of the road was the cold, indifferent earth. The legends of the American West are immortal, but the men who inspired them were tragically short-lived. In the gritty ledger of frontier history, there is a grim tally of the ends met by the West's most famous names, and it is a record of violence, betrayal, and early graves. For the vast majority of those who chose the life of the desperado, the path didn't lead to a quiet ranch or a peaceful retirement. It led to a sudden, violent stop. In an era where the average life expectancy was already low, the outlaw's lifespan was a mere fraction of that, often extinguished before they reached their 30th birthday. Infamy in the Old West was a double-edged sword that cut deep and fast. The more famous a man became, the shorter his life expectancy grew. Billy the Kid, perhaps the most iconic figure of the era, was only 21 when he was gunned down in the dark by Pat Garrett. Jesse James was 34, a veteran by outlaw standards, when he was murdered in his own living room. The Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy were in their late 30s when they were reportedly cornered and killed in a dusty showdown in Bolivia. These weren't men who aged gracefully. They were men who burned bright and hot, only to be snuffed out in a spray of lead. The nature of their deaths was rarely heroic. The tally shows a recurring pattern of backstabbing and ambush. John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed dozens of men, was shot in the back of the head while playing dice in an El Paso saloon. Wild Bill Hickok was holding a pair of aces and eights when a coward's bullet entered the back of his skull. The reality was that as these men grew older, they became slower, more predictable, and more valuable as a payday for someone else. Few ever lived long enough to see the gray in their hair, and those who did often spent their final years as shells of their former selves, performing in Wild West shows to buy a bottle of whiskey. The high price of infamy also extended to the physical remains of these outlaws. In a final indignity, the bodies of famous outlaws were often put on public display. After the Dalton gang's disastrous attempt to rob 2 banks at once in Coffeyville, their riddled corpses were lined up on the pavement for the townspeople to gape at and photograph. These death portraits served as a grim deterrent, a message from the law that the romanticized outlaw was, in the end, just cold meat and tattered clothes. Ultimately, the tally reveals a sobering truth. The outlaw life was a dead-end street. Out of the hundreds of men who took to the outlaw trail, you can count on one hand those who survived to old age. Most found their final resting place in Boot Hill cemeteries, graveyards named for the men who died with their boots on, too fast to even prepare for the end. They left behind no empires, no legacies of wealth, only a collection of cautionary tales and a blood-stained spot in the dirt. The price of their names living forever was that they, themselves, never got to live at all. If the desolate canyons were the outlaws' bedrooms, the saloons and gambling halls were their living rooms. In the rugged architecture of a frontier town, the saloon was the center of gravity, a chaotic, smoke-filled sanctuary where the West's most dangerous residents could step out of the shadows and into the flickering light of a chandelier. These were the social hubs of the underworld, places where the air was thick with the scent of spilled rye, cheap tobacco, and the palpable electricity of men who had nothing to lose. Here, the dead man's hand wasn't just a poker myth. It was a daily possibility. For an outlaw, the saloon served a dual purpose. It was a place to spend ill-gotten gains and a vital intelligence network. Between the clinking of glasses and the rhythmic thrum of a tinny piano, secrets were traded like currency. A man could learn which stagecoach was carrying a gold shipment, which sheriff was out of town, or which trail was currently being watched by the Pinkertons. The underground telegraph operated at the bar rail. In towns like Deadwood, Cheyenne, or Fort Griffin, the saloon was the only place where a fugitive could feel a fleeting sense of normalcy, surrounded by gamblers, drifters, and fellow long riders who lived by the same violent code. However, the saloon was also a pressure cooker. When you mix heavy drinking, high-stakes gambling, and a room full of men carrying loaded revolvers, violence is an inevitability. Most frontier gunfights didn't start over land or politics. They started over a disputed card game or a drunken insult. The gambling halls were the primary theaters of this recreational violence. Games like faro and poker were the lifeblood of these establishments, and in a world where cheating was often a survival skill, a slip of the hand could lead to a funeral. The dead man's hand, pairs of aces and eights, became the eternal symbol of this fragility, forever linked to Wild Bill Hickok's final moments in a Deadwood saloon. The vices of the West, whiskey and gambling, were the outlaws' greatest weaknesses. A successful robbery might net a gang thousands of dollars, but that wealth rarely lasted a month. The money flowed through their fingers and into the pockets of the saloon keepers and professional rounders. These establishments were designed to bleed the outlaws dry, offering a temporary escape from the life on the run in exchange for every cent they had. It was a vicious cycle. Rob a train to pay the gambling debts, then gamble away the spoils of the next heist. The saloon didn't just host the outlaws, it consumed them. Ultimately, these social hubs were where the outlaw legend was both polished and tarnished. It was where the stories were told and the reputations were made, but it was also where the guards were lowered. More outlaws were captured or killed in saloons than in any other setting. In the warm glow of the kerosene lamps, with a glass of rotgut in hand and a winning hand on the table, a man could almost forget the wanted posters waiting outside. But the frontier had a way of reminding them, usually with the sudden, cold press of a lawman's pistol against the back of the neck, or the roar of a shotgun from a darkened corner. The death of the American outlaw didn't come with a dramatic final shootout or a grand surrender. It came with the quiet, rhythmic clicking of the telegraph and the metallic stretch of barbed wire. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, the Wild West was being hemmed in. The vast, open plains that once allowed a man to ride for 1,000 miles without seeing a fence were being carved into neat, square parcels of private property. As the fences went up, the era of the outlaw faced a slow, inevitable death, suffocated by the very progress it had tried so hard to outrun. The introduction of barbed wire, ironically called the devil's rope by the old-timers, was perhaps more lethal to the outlaw than any marshal's bullet. For decades, the outlaw's greatest ally had been the geography of the open range. A fugitive could disappear into the horizon because there were no boundaries. But as cattle barons and homesteaders began to fence off the land, the escape routes vanished. The prairie was no longer a highway, it was a grid. A man on a stolen horse could no longer cut across the country. He was forced onto established roads and through gates, making him an easy target for any local deputy with a shotgun and a bit of patience. Simultaneously, the telegraph lines moved in, weaving a web of instant communication that destroyed the outlaw's greatest advantage: time. In the early days, an outlaw could rob a bank and be 2 days away before the news even reached the next county. But with the telegraph, news of a crime traveled at the speed of electricity. By the time a gang had finished bagging the gold, the sheriff in the next 3 towns already had their descriptions. The world was becoming smaller, and the shadows where a man could hide were being illuminated by the glow of a modernizing nation. The law was no longer a man on a horse. It was a network of wires that never slept. This technological strangulation was coupled with the arrival of the transcontinental railroads, which brought a flood of new settlers. These weren't the desperate drifters of the post-Civil War era. These were families, businessmen, and civilized folk who had no patience for the chaos of the gunfighter. They demanded order and stability to protect their investments. The rugged individualism that had birthed the outlaw was now viewed as a relic of a primitive past. The town councils began to pass no carry laws, requiring visitors to check their pistols at the city limits. The Wild West was being domesticated, turned into a series of quiet farming communities and orderly railroad hubs. The final stand of the outlaw was a pathetic, lingering affair. The great gangs were broken, and the remaining desperados were forced into ever smaller pockets of wilderness. They were like wolves in a shrinking forest, hunted not just for their crimes, but because they simply didn't fit into the new world. By the turn of the century, the outlaw wasn't a hero or even a feared villain. He was a nuisance, a ghost from a century that had already passed. The open range had closed, and with it, the curtain fell on the most violent and vibrant chapter of American history. The dust has long since settled on the Kishom Trail, and the black powder smoke has cleared from the streets of Tombstone. Yet, more than a century after the last great gangs were hunted into extinction, the image of the outlaw remains burned into the American psyche. There is a strange, enduring paradox at the heart of this history. How did these violent men, many of whom were thieves, murderers, and cowards, become the ultimate symbols of American freedom? To reflect on the legacy of the Old West is to realize that we don't remember the outlaws for who they actually were, but for what they represented in an increasingly crowded and regulated world. The outlaw legend persists because it speaks to a fundamental American tension, the conflict between the desire for civilization and the primal urge for total autonomy. As the 20th century brought skyscrapers, factory whistles, and tax codes, the figure of the man on a horse, accountable to no one but himself and the horizon, became a powerful cultural sedative. We chose to forget the cold-blooded reality of Jesse James or Billy the Kid, and instead reimagine them as social bandits, rebels who stood up against the faceless greed of the railroads and the banks. In our folklore, the outlaw became the ultimate individualist, the one person who refused to be fenced in by the devil's rope. This romanticization began almost before the bodies were cold. The dime novels of the late 1800s transformed gritty criminals into cardboard heroes, and later, the silver screen of Hollywood polished the spurs of the desperado until they shone. We turned the messy, short-lived reality of the shootout into a choreographed dance of honor. This legacy serves as a mirror of our own anxieties. When we feel trapped by the telegraph wires of the modern age, the digital surveillance, the 9-to-5 grind, and the complexities of urban life, the myth of the outlaw offers a fantasy of escape. We don't want to be criminals, but we secretly long for the freedom to simply ride away. The enduring legacy also lies in the landscape itself. The Badlands, the high Sierras, and the vast deserts of the Southwest still hold the echoes of the frontier. These places remain largely indifferent to the passage of time, serving as a physical reminder of the scale of the world these men inhabited. To stand in a place like Robber's Roost today is to feel the weight of that silence and the crushing pressure of the horizon. It is here that the myth feels most real, not in the pages of a history book, but in the red dust that still covers the boots of anyone brave enough to go looking for the past. Ultimately, the story of the real life outlaw is a story of the American soul. It is a gritty, unvarnished tale of dust and desperation, but it is also a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be tamed. We keep these stories alive because they remind us of a time when the world was wide and the rules were few. The outlaws were flawed, violent, and often terrified human beings, but in the theater of our memory, they remain the last guardians of the wild. They are the ghosts of our frontier, riding forever through the shadows of the American West, reminding us that there will always be a part of the human heart that belongs to the lawless, open range.